But we're gonna pick up where we left off last week. If you were here last week, you know we're in Ruth chapter 2, and we ended last week with verse 10. And for those who weren't here, just a quick recap of what we looked at last week. So in the book of Ruth, it starts off with saying that this all happened during the time of the judges, and we talked about how during the time of judges there was no king. It was lawlessness. It was immorality everywhere. And in the midst of that, we have this story of Ruth. And what happens is there's famine in the land of Judah, God's promised land. And so this man named Elimelech packs up his wife Naomi and their 2 sons, and they move to Moab. And that's a bad idea. That's outside of God's protection. That's outside of his promised land. The land of Moab were enemies of God's people. So it was sinful for him to do that. And after they moved to Moab, we see that tragedy strikes. Elimelech dies. His 2 sons marry Moabite women, also not a good thing according to God's law. And then they die. And so Naomi is left in a foreign land in the worst tragedy of her life with 2 Moabite daughters-in-law. And tragedy strikes. And we talked about last week that in this book there's 2 major problems that the characters are trying to solve. One is the problem of food, and one is the problem of rest. And we talked about the Hebrew word for rest means family. It means comfort and security of a spouse, of sons, of a family, finding protection in that family. So the characters are looking from that from the very beginning. It says there's famine, there's no food, and then Elimelech and his 2 sons die. And so they're lost, and they're looking for food, and they're looking for family. And then we see then that God provides for the people back in Judah and ends the famine. So Naomi packs up her daughters-in-law, and they get ready to go, and then Orpah decides she's going to stay, but Ruth goes, and they get back to Bethlehem, which is where they're from, and they have to come up with some way to get food. And so Ruth tells Naomi, I'm going to go out and I'm going to be among the poor people that get to come behind the harvesters and try and scrape together something to eat, right? And so she goes out, and it says she just happens to end up, luckily by chance, ends up in this man named Boaz's field. And we talked last week about how that wasn't by chance. It wasn't by luck. God, throughout this whole book, he's not in the forefront. He's in the background, putting the pieces in place, orchestrating everything. And so she ends up in Boaz's field. Boaz comes to meet Ruth, and he blesses her. We talked about how he tells her to stay in his field. He will protect her. He will provide for her. He will give her more than she could ever want or need as long as she stays in his field. And we ended last week with verse 10, where she falls down at Boaz's feet and says, why have I found such favor in your eyes? I'm just a foreigner. I'm just a Gentile widow. Why are you showing me such favor? That's where we ended last week. Something else we talked about is that names are important in this book. We talked about a lot of names last week and their meanings. In this book, the author uses names a lot, and they all represent something within the story. So going on from verse 10, Ruth falls down at the feet of Boaz, and she says, why have I found such favor? Why are you treating me like this? I don't deserve this. And Boaz then goes on to tell her from verse 11 on, he tells her that he has heard about her story. He's heard about her husband dying. He has heard that she left her mother and her father and her homeland. She has left everything behind to serve God and to serve Naomi. And so he says, I had compassion on you, is basically what he says. I heard about this. And then he prays a prayer of blessing over Ruth. He says, may the Lord bless you. May he show you the kindness that you have shown to your mother-in-law. He says, the God of Israel, in whose wings you have found refuge. And it goes on, it says that he takes Ruth as they break for lunch one day working in the fields. He says, Ruth, come sit at my table. And we have this great picture of Boaz, the master of the field, and he's serving the servant lunch. It reminds us of Matthew 20, verse 28, where Jesus says, the Son of Man came to serve, not to be served, and to give his life for the many. So the master of the field serves the servant. And then after lunch, he tells his men, he says, hey, if y'all remember from last week, the poor people were allowed to go behind the harvesters and try and gather what was dropped or what was left behind on the ground. And so he tells his men, he says, hey, start dropping some good stalks of grain and let her pick them up. And don't embarrass her, don't shame her, just drop them and don't pick them up. Let Ruth get them. So he provides for Ruth, and then what we see is that by the end of the day, it says that she ends the day and goes home to Naomi, and she's got an ephah or a ephah worth of grain, and that measurement for us is about 30 pounds. So she takes home 30 pounds. She brings them in a sack. She sets it on the counter, says, looky here, Naomi, and then she pulls out a to-go box from lunch because she couldn't eat it all. And so she brings it home to Naomi, and she says, here's 30 pounds of grain, and here's a to-go box from lunch. Boaz served it. It was good. And what we see is, and what we're going to start with today is, we are blessed to be a blessing. Okay? God blessed Boaz. He blessed Boaz with this field to harvest. Boaz then passes that blessing on to Ruth. He says, drop what you can, drop good stalks of grain, let her pick up what she can, carry it home. And Ruth comes home and blesses Naomi. Okay? We are blessed so that we can be a blessing. If you are praying for blessing in your life, but you have no forethought or no idea of passing that blessing on, you are missing what a blessing is. We receive from the Lord so that we can bless others. Okay? So she carries this sack of grain home, and just to give us some perspective, 30 pounds of grain would have equaled about 3 weeks' worth of pay. So she literally in one day comes home with 3 weeks' worth of pay. The idea here is she has been blessed abundantly, and God is taking care of Ruth and Naomi. Remember, problem number one is we got to find something to eat. We got to figure out how we're going to feed ourselves, because we don't have men that can provide for us anymore. And that's where we're picking up, is she's brought this grain home to Naomi, and she also brought the to-go box. And in verse 19 of chapter 2, it says, her mother-in-law asked her, where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz, she said. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, that man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers. Let's pray real quick. God, we thank you for what you're showing us through your word today, Father. And we ask, God, that you would make it plain and clear. God, I pray that you would break down hard hearts this morning so that we can receive your truth. Holy Spirit, come and speak this morning to us. In your name we pray, Jesus. Amen. So where we're starting here is Naomi's response to the blessing that Ruth has received. She's brought home food. And she's brought home a lot more food than we ever could have expected. But we learned something here that we didn't know. Okay? Because not only has she brought home food, but she says, where in the world did you work today? What man took notice of you? She realized this is not normal. You were shown favor today. She says, where were you working? And she says, I was just in some guy's field, just happened to end up in this guy named Boaz, his field, and it just worked out. We really hit it off and, had lunch. It was cool. So she says, I worked with Boaz, and immediately Naomi praises Boaz, and she says, he's shown kindness to the living and the dead. He's one of our close relatives. We go back to chapter 2, verse 1. When we first meet Boaz, it says he was a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech. Naomi's husband's name was Elimelech. So what we have just learned is they're relatives. Okay, so you have family. Family takes care of the family, all right? And then you got a group of families makes up a clan. Group of clans makes up a tribe, and the 12 tribes make up the nation. Okay? So what we've just learned is Boaz isn't just a nice guy. Boaz is their redeemer. In Leviticus 25, God's law set up what's known as the kinsman redeemer. Kinsman meaning relative, redeemer meaning somebody that can purchase back, right? Somebody that can buy. The idea is God set it up in his law that when a family or family member fell on hard times, tragedy strikes, circumstances in life hit, whatever it may be, if they are made poor, by life circumstances, sometimes they would have to sell the family property, the family land, the family possessions, or even the family name. They would give themselves in slavery to someone to pay off debt. And so the kinsman redeemer was a family member that was able, that had the money and was willing, could come in place of that family member that's being held because of debt or because of hard times, having to sell the land, the property, the possessions, or even go into slavery. That relative could then come in and buy the family property back, buy the family possessions back, buy the family back out of slavery and redeem them. Okay, so the idea here is Boaz is not just a nice guy. What we've just learned is he is that guy. He is the kinsman redeemer. He is someone that can bring Naomi and Ruth out of their poverty, out of their circumstances by God's law. She says he's one of our close relatives. So we see Naomi tells Ruth, you need to stay with Boaz. Ruth says, well, he offered me a job. I can stay until the end of the grain harvest. Naomi says, do it. And so Ruth works for Boaz the rest of the grain harvest. So the barley harvest would have started in about April, and the grain and everything would have been finished up around June. So she's got work for a couple of months at least. And we've already found out that she's already got a great head start because of all the grain that she brought home. What we end chapter 2 with is problem number 1 has been solved. Okay? Food is provided. Ruth is working for Boaz with the women that work for Boaz in the fields. Food has been provided. Problem number 1, we said there's 2 problems in the book. Problem number 1, taken care of. She's going to work for Boaz and she's going to receive food that way. So that brings us to chapter 3. We're going to look at problem number 2, rest or family. Y'all look at chapter 3, verse 1. It says, one day Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi said to her, my daughter, I must find a home for you, where you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he was finished eating and drinking. And when he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor, and she did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking, he was in good spirits. He went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. Well, things just got awkward. So we got food taken care of. Now we're looking for rest, family. And so where Ruth went to Naomi in chapter 2 and said, I've got a plan, I'm going to go work in the fields. Now Naomi comes to Ruth and says, I've got a plan for us to find rest. And so she goes to Ruth. The word in verse 1 of chapter 3, it says, my daughter, I must find you a home, is the same word in Hebrew that's used in chapter 1 when Naomi tells her daughter-in-laws, I need to find you rest. It's the same word, rest, home, this idea of family, comfort in the home, security, provision, all of that. That's the problem we're trying to solve. So Naomi says, I got a plan. I know Boaz is going to be working late tonight. Why don't you go on down to the threshing floor? So she tells Ruth, she says, I need you to go. You need to take a shower. You need to put on some good perfume, and you need to wear your best clothes. Go down there and have a little time with Boaz. Okay? Now, because we don't live in this culture anymore, there's some things that we could misunderstand here. And we need to make sure we understand what's being said and what's being done. Naomi and Ruth, along with Boaz, are all honorable people who follow the Lord. Okay? So Naomi is not telling Ruth, go down to the threshing floor and turn on the red light. Okay? We need to cover that. All right? What she is saying here is she is telling Ruth it's time to move on. In that culture, probably what's being said here is, as a widow, she's still wearing the for lack of a better word, the outfit of a grieving widow to mark her mourning, to mark her grieving over the tragedy that has struck her life. What Naomi is saying is, it's time to take that off. It's time to clean up, put on perfume, put on your best clothes. It's time to move on. Put your past behind you. The time for grieving is over. It's time to move on. Okay. Also, we've seen leading up to this that Boaz is seeking Ruth, right? He is pursuing Ruth. Not every girl in the field gets to go to lunch with Boaz, okay? He has made special effort for Ruth. And so what Naomi is telling Ruth is, he's made effort. It's time for you to show that you're available, that you're interested, that this is a possibility. So she says, get dressed, go down to the threshing floor, and then she gives her some really sound advice. I don't know if anybody caught it, but she says, when you go down there, don't walk up to Boaz while he's finishing winnowing the grain and say, hey, Boaz, I know you're working, I know you're sweaty, I know you're busy right now, and it's been a long day, but I think it's time we talk about this relationship. I think we need to see where this is going. Like, are you serious about this? Because I think I might be serious. I mean, are we talking marriage here? What are we thinking here, Boaz? That's not the time. The conversation is not going to go well, right? What does she tell her to do? She says, all right, you go down there, but you hide. Wait till he has something to eat, something to drink, takes a little nap. That's the time to talk to him. Women, men, feel free to amen at any point. This is sound advice from an older widow to a younger widow. If you want the conversation to go well, don't wait till he walks in the door just with the weight of the world trying to come off of him from a long day and say, hey, what do you think about our marriage? Right? I'm trying not to step on too many landmines with this, but the conversation always goes a lot better for me, in my home anyways, if I get my belly full, give me something cold to drink and kind of relax from the day for a minute, that I'm a whole lot more open to what we're going to talk about. Men. Thank you. God, trying to help us out. No, but she does. She tells her, look, wait till his day is over with. Now, something else we need to understand here is it says she does exactly what Naomi tells her to do. She goes down there, she lets Boaz finish working. It says he eats and he drinks and he's in good spirits. We need to make something clear also here. Verse 1 tells us in chapter 2 that he's a man of standing. That word means that he is a man of integrity, of character, who is serving the Lord. So this is not the story of Lot. Okay, this is not where Lot gets drunk and his daughters take advantage of him. Naomi is not saying, Ruth, you need to go down there and wait till Boaz is buzzed and then trick him into marrying. That's not what Naomi's saying. The idea in the Hebrew, literally in the Hebrew, what it says is he ate and he drank and his heart felt good. Okay? The idea is not that he is drunk or compromised in any way. It's he's content. Okay? He's put in a good hard day's work. He's got his belly full and he's about to lay his head down content, in peace. His heart felt good. Okay? And she says at that point, let him go to sleep. And then she says, go and lie at his feet, uncover his feet and lay down. Also, something that we probably don't understand and I do not encourage for anyone to do. In our day and time, it wouldn't make sense. But what she tells her basically is, you go lay down and you uncover his feet. That was a sign of I am seeking marriage. Okay, by the woman, she's saying I am seeking marriage with you. Okay, she says uncover his feet. He'll tell you what to do. So in the middle of the night, it says Boaz was startled and he woke up. I'm guessing he's startled from the cold breeze. But she has gone and uncovered his feet. And he's laying there and he looks up or he looks down and there's a woman laying at his feet. He says, who are you? And she says, I'm your servant Ruth. Spread your garment over me because you're our Redeemer. The idea is she uncovers his feet so that he can cover her. So she uncovers his feet. If he covers her with the blanket, that's a sign that I accept. All right? I'm willing to marry you. I will redeem the family. It's really it's really cool to me that in the beginning of chapter 2, in verse 12 and 13, when Boaz prays the prayer of blessing over Ruth, he tells her, "May the Lord bless you, the God of Israel, in whose wings you have taken refuge." That word in the Hebrew for wings is the exact same word that's used here for garment. It's just translated different because of the context. The idea here is, just as you have found refuge in the wings of the Lord, find refuge here, protection from a husband. Go one step further. Really what she's saying is, hey, Boaz, you remember when you prayed that I would find refuge under some wings? You're the answer to your own prayer, Boaz. Marry me. And so it's the same idea. She says, cover me with your garment. Be my protector. Marry me. She says, because you are our family redeemer. So we go on from there. And Boaz tells her, you know what? I've heard that you are a woman of noble character. Everybody knows that you're a woman of noble character. Same word there. When it talks about Boaz being a man of standing, it's the same word for Ruth here, a woman of noble character. It's the same word that's used to describe the woman in Proverbs 31, starting in verse 10, the wife of noble character. The Hebrew word is chayel, and chayel means a warrior of God's character. It means everything good, a hero, someone who is virtuous, who lives honestly and fights for the right. Okay? He says, I know that you are a warrior for righteousness. You are a woman of noble character. So he says, yes, I will marry you. And remember, I talked about last week how this is a great, great love story. Even outside of Scripture, literature has this as a great love story. And this is the point in the story where all the ladies, if this was a movie, everybody would be, yes, he said yes, he's going to marry him. Break out the tissues. Happily ever after, Ruth and Boaz, right? And so Boaz says, I will do everything that you ask. I will take my place as the Redeemer, and I will marry you, Ruth. And then he says, well, there's one problem. He says, I'll do everything that you ask, but there's another guy that's got first dibs. See, in the law of the kinsman redeemer, it was the closest relative who was willing and able. And so what Boaz tells Ruth is he says, I'll marry you, but because I'm a man of the Lord, because I'm going to follow the law, first we have to go talk to this guy because he actually has first dibs. He's a closer relative than I. And so he has the first rights to the property, to the possessions, and to marrying you. And so he says, in the morning I'll go talk to him and I'll see if he wants to redeem you. And if he wants to redeem you, then great, I'll let him. And if not, then I'll marry you. And then he tells Ruth, just lay down, go to sleep. We'll deal with it in the morning. And Ruth, I'm guessing, probably didn't sleep. Because in a matter of moments, she's just found out that within 24 hours, she's either going to marry the man that she knows and loves now as Boaz, or some guy she didn't even know existed. But either way, one of those two options is going to happen within the next 24 hours. And I love it. She comes home and Naomi's waiting at the end of chapter 3, and Naomi says, how'd it go? What happened? Tell me all about it. And Ruth says, well, little surprise, little twist here. There's actually somebody else, and I don't even know who it is. And Naomi's response to Ruth is, well, then wait. Just be patient. It's going to get handled. Anybody ever had that thrown at them? I don't understand. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm worried. I'm stressed out. And somebody says, quit worrying about it. God's got it. That's what Naomi tells Ruth. She says, don't worry. It'll be settled. It's going to work out. So we move on to chapter 4. And in chapter 4, we start in verse 1. It says, meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate, and he sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. And Boaz said, come over here, my friend, and sit down. So he went over and sat down. So in this day and time, they didn't write up contracts and sign papers. So what happens here is Boaz goes to the city gates. That's where business transactions took place. And so Boaz goes there. He finds the guy, the redeemer that he's told Ruth about. And it says later on he gathers the elders, or he gathers some elders within the city, and they're gonna talk about what needs to happen. At the city gates, that's where if you were going to buy land or you were going to sell land or you were going to have some kind of legal dispute, like I said, they didn't do contracts, so you went to the city gates, you gathered elders as witnesses, and so you would agree on whatever the terms were, and those elders would be witnesses. And so if there was ever a dispute over the land or the legal matters or whatever it was, you gathered those elders back together and said, what happened? Who's right? Okay? And so that's what Boaz does. He goes to the city gates, he gets this guy, this other relative, and he gathers up elders, and he begins to lay out to this other guy what's going on. So he says to him, he says, hey, Naomi, our relative, is looking to sell some land, and we need to redeem it as family members. And he says, you have first rights to it. You can redeem it. And the guy immediately says, I'll buy it. He's seeing dollar signs because he's thinking, okay, I've got land that I can buy fairly cheap, and I've got Naomi that's an older widow. I don't really have to worry much about her, and everything's on the positive right now. So he says, I'll buy it. I will redeem it. Where do we go to finish this up? And Boaz says, there's one little thing I forgot to mention. He says, Ruth, her daughter-in-law goes with the deal. He says, and she's young enough for you to marry, and you can carry on the family line of Elimelech. If you remember last week, I mentioned the Levirate law, which is found in Deuteronomy 25. And the book of Ruth kind of merges these two laws, the kinsman redeemer and the Levirate law. The Levirate law said if a man died, his brother would marry the man's widow, and the kids that they had would keep the dead man's name, and all the inheritance, all the property, everything would go to those kids. And so basically what Boaz has just told this man is, you can redeem the land, but it's only going to be yours for a little bit because you have to take Ruth, and whatever kids y'all have, everything's going to be transferred to them. And the man immediately goes, never mind, Boaz, you can have it. When it looked profitable, when it looked like it was going to benefit only him, he said, I'll do it, I'll buy it, you bet. But when it said, when Boaz says, no, this is for your family because Ruth is going to have kids and then everything that you buy is going to go to them, he says, no, Boaz, you take it. He says, this may hurt my money. This may hurt my property. It's no longer beneficial for him. What we see in this man is he's one of the few characters in this story who acts selfishly. We see Boaz bless Ruth. We see Ruth bless Naomi. Ruth left everything for Naomi. And everybody in the story is acting sacrificially. Everybody in the story is giving themselves for someone else's better. And here we have this guy who acts selfishly, who says, if it doesn't benefit me, I don't want to do my duty. I don't want to provide for the family and redeem them. Something else we see, and we've talked about, is almost every person in this story is named. Almost every person in this story has a name and has a meaning. This guy doesn't. It says when Boaz goes to the city gates, he says, come here, my friend. Literally in the Hebrew, it says, Mr. So-and-so. It's like he said, hey, buddy, old pal, come on over here. Let's have a talk. Now Boaz knows this guy. He knew about him. As soon as Ruth mentioned marriage, he says, wait, there's another guy. He's a close relative. Boaz knows his name. But the author doesn't give it to us. He calls him Mr. So-and-so. Why? Because he says he's not worth mentioning because this man won't stand up and provide for his family. So he says he's not, the implication is here, he's not worth giving a name to because all he cares about is himself and not providing for his family. I think a lot of times we try and shame men into doing things. We want to say, you need to be the spiritual leader of your home. You need to do this, you need to do that. Your life's in shambles because you're not the spiritual leader of your home, and shake our finger and shame them. And I'm not doing that this morning, men. What I'm saying is we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to take hold of. And that is we can be Boaz. We said last week Boaz means strength. Boaz, a man of standing, a chayil, warrior for good, for the Lord. That could be us. We have the opportunity to be Boaz to our wives, to our kids, to our families, men. Let's take hold of it. Because the other option is we can be Mr. So-and-so. Somebody that's not worth mentioning. Because instead of taking the steps to do right for his family, he says, it's not worth the risk. Might get hurt, might hurt my inheritance, might not be so beneficial for me. Might have to sacrifice what I want. Man, we have the opportunity to be warriors for our family. It's in us. Yesterday I was watching TV, came in, flipped it on, and The Patriot was on. Anybody remember that movie? Mel Gibson, right? And it just happened to be that scene where he's quit. If you haven't seen the movie, I apologize, but it's been out for a while. So, but anyways, he quits. His sons have died in the war, set during the Revolutionary War, and his sons have died, and he just says, I'm done. I've given everything I have. I'm not fighting anymore. And the man above him comes in and says, we need you. He says, go have your victory. Y'all can win without me. He says, no, we can't. He says, the men follow you. And he pulls out the flag that's all tattered that his son had been trying to sew back together from battle. And in the scene that I'm talking about, they're marching, they're all beat up and shot, and they're going on. And here comes the Patriot, Mel Gibson's character, and he's got that tattered flag flying in the wind as he comes loping across the pasture, right? He comes loping across there, and everybody goes nuts. All the troops are screaming and yelling, and all of a sudden, all these guys that are beat up and shot and wounded are jumping up and screaming and ready to go to war. Guys, that could be us. That's in us. God has called us to be warriors for our family. God has called us to take up the banner for Him. And when we will do that, it says our families are the ones that we're leading. Our families, though beat up and tattered and worn, are the ones that stand up and are right there ready to fight with us if we will just take up the banner and be those warriors for the Lord. So the man tells Boaz, you redeem it. I don't want to do it. So Boaz agrees. He says, then I'll do it. I'm gonna redeem the family property, and I'm also gonna redeem Ruth and Naomi. I'm gonna take Ruth as my bride, and he says, and we're gonna keep the family line of Elimelech going. And so we end the book in chapter 4, verse 13. It says, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. And it goes on later, and it tells us that son's name was Obed. So the story ends, and we're back to happily ever after, right? It says Ruth and Boaz get married, and they have a son, which is what they wanted, all right? And now he's going to be able to keep the family line going. It's a great end. Last week we talked about how we went from tragedy to hope. This week it's hope to victory. We ended last week with just a small glimpse of hope, and we've seen that it has come full circle into restoring Ruth and Naomi and the family. Okay? If we ended there, it would be an awesome story. It would be a great story of how God, through the faithfulness of His people, brought these two widows to restoration, to redemption, right? But that's not where it ends. Remember, I said there's two problems throughout this whole book we're trying to solve. And that was the problem of food and the problem of family. And I said last week, and I think I said it this week, that God is not in the forefront of this book. There is no parting seas. There is no fire from heaven. He is in the background placing the pieces on the table. All right? He is orchestrating everything. He is using His people to bless one another. He's using the faithfulness and obedience of His people to achieve His will. There's only 2 times that the narrator shows God actively doing something. And that's in chapter 1. in verse 6, where it says that God heard the plea of his people. He heard that, and he came to their aid during the famine. And it says God provided food for them. And the second time he's active is in chapter 4, verse 13, where it says, the Lord enabled her to conceive. We didn't talk about this, but Ruth was barren. She was married for 10 years with no children. That would not have been by choice. Okay, she couldn't have kids. The idea here is God enabled her to have kids after bringing her through this. But what I want us to see is the two problems in the book, food and family, were solved by God. He used the people in obedience to achieve his will, but the two times he's active is he provides the food and he provides the family. It's ultimately God's work. He lets us be a part of it, but it's him working. He provides the food, he provides the family. It'd be a great story if it ended there. But that's not the end of it. Look at verse 17 in chapter 4. It says, the women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And then it ends with the genealogy of David. And a lot of times we look at genealogies and we think, skip, because we don't understand the names, and really it's not that important, right? But it is. The very end, it lists the genealogy of David. Obed, the father of Jesse. Jesse, the father of David. Chapter 1, verse 1 starts with, in the days when the judges ruled, when there was no king, when there was no law, when everybody just did whatever they wanted to do, sin run rampant. And very last verse, it ends with King David, the greatest king that the nation of Israel would know. God is not just redeeming these two widows from the darkest, most disparaging days of their lives and bringing them back to faithfulness and obedience in him. He's not just redeeming these two widows. He's not just providing a son for Ruth. In the midst of the worst time in Israel's history, he says, don't worry, I've got this. I am starting the line of the greatest king you will ever know. When there was no king and there was complete lawlessness, God says, I'm going to start this line for the king. But even more so, we're not finished there. Go to Matthew. Actually, you don't have to go there. I'll flip there. Matthew chapter 1, we see something very similar. In verses 5 and 6, it says, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse. And Jesse, the father of King David. We skip on down to the end. In verse 16, it says, And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. God wasn't just redeeming Ruth and Naomi. He was setting up plans to redeem all of his children. Where was the Messiah to come from? Bethlehem. Where the line of David from Bethlehem. How did they get back to Bethlehem? By a Moabite named Ruth, who said, my people will be your people, and your God my God. She left everything in her past to be obedient to the Lord. Through the darkest days, through the worst tragedy that she could ever have imagined, in an instant, her life flipped upside down. God says, I'm going to use this, not just to bring redemption for you and Naomi, but far greater than you could ever imagine. The victory isn't that they had a baby. The victory is that God is providing for the Messiah. That's the God we serve. That's the God we serve. I used to have a horse. I realize that was a bad segue, but just a second. I've shared this story before, but I had this horse years ago, and I'll go ahead and admit it. He was a paint horse. God has healed me from that sin, but he was a paint horse, and anyways, and I bought this horse for next to nothing for good reason. I remember the first time I worked or pushed cows around on him. It was down here in the arena, And we were practicing for a ranch rodeo, and the first time I worked cows on him, he stood up and flipped over backwards with me. And I thought, oh, this is good. And, and everybody was giving me a hard time about that ugly paint horse that I was riding, and now I needed to get rid of him or worse, and all this stuff. And his name was Flip Flop, and we gave him that name after that night in the arena. and he was. I mean, everybody gave me a hard time about that horse. And then we went to West Texas, and out there around Sheffield, it was either straight up or straight down, gathering cattle out there. And turns out old Flip Flop was part mountain goat, and he never missed a step all day long. He carried me through really, really rough country, and that day we built a bond that I've never had with another horse. I've never trusted a horse more than I did that horse. That horse that wasn't much to look at, really wasn't that great, but I put my life in him. It finally got to the point where, look, I'm going to quit second guessing this horse because I figure he don't want to roll down the mountain any more than I do. So I'll just let him go where he wants to go, and we'll make it, right? It was through going through that rough country, the mountains and the box canyons, and all through that built that bond between me and that horse. That I haven't trusted a horse like that since. God is the same with us, right? He takes something, just like that illustration I used with the cow kids. He takes something that's rough and doesn't look that good, that's covered in sin and dirty, and he says, I'm going to take you through some rough country. It's going to be hard. There's going to be jagged edges, and it's going to be nasty. But when we come through that, he says, you're going to trust me more. You're going to be purified. You're going to be ready to trust me even more for the next step. He says, I will take something that people say is worth nothing, and I will give it purpose and say that it is my child, that it is worth the blood of my son on the cross. Maybe you're here today and you're like Elimelech. You want to give up trust in God, and you've gone into the land of Moab, and you say, I've sinned. I hear what you're saying, Rob, but it ain't for me because you don't know the sin that's in my life. Our story started with a man going into sin, and God took that sin and turned it around to bring about Jesus. So don't tell me that sin is too great. There is no sin too great for the blood of my Jesus. There is no sin too great that his grace will not cover it and declare me righteous in his eyes. Okay? Maybe you're like Naomi. Life has just dealt you some bad stuff right now. Tragedy has struck, so much so that she comes back and she says, I'm not Naomi anymore. I'm Mara. I am bitter. I'm not even who I used to be because of life's rough times. God says there's still hope if you will trust me. I will provide for you greater than you can ever imagine. I will redeem this. Romans 8:28 says that God works all things for the good of those who love him. Another way to translate it is it's for our own good, for the ultimate good. There's a lot of things that I do for my children for their own good that they do not appreciate, right? Too often we take that verse to mean that it's all going to work out, everything's going to be rainbows and sunshine because God's going to make everything good. That's not what it says. It says he will make all things for our good, for those who love him. Sometimes for our good, we got to be stuck in the fire and beat up on. Sometimes, as hard as it is for us to accept it, sometimes tragedy can be used by God to bring about triumph. If you're sitting here today and you don't know what that looks like, that's Jesus giving his life on a cross for us that we don't deserve that. As Boaz showed Ruth grace that she couldn't understand, the same is true for us. The Lord has showed us grace that we can't comprehend. Because by all measures, we shouldn't be worth that. We're not worth that. But he says, by my grace, by my blood. I'm going to wash those sins away. I'm going to redeem you from the worst of the worst. And sometimes it's going to mean going through the fire, but I am going to restore you and redeem you. And sometimes that comes long after we're gone. Ruth never knew this side of glory, that she was going to be the great grandmother to Jesus. She never knew that. But God used the tragedy in her life to bless so many others way down the line. Us. Sometimes our tragedies, we don't see the victories until we get to heaven. But trust me in this, because I believe it, because it's truth in God's word. God redeems those he calls, he loves. All right, let's pray.